I still dig before I plant. Not a gentle turning of soil, a real excavation, spade deep, checking for what lies beneath. For the bones of animals buried with love, for the rusted tanks of poisons forgotten, for the secrets that generations layer into earth like sediment. My neighbors think I'm obsessive. They don't know that land remembers everything, that soil is history compressed, that the man who sold my family's farm for golf courses believed the surface was all that mattered. He was wrong. The surface is decoration. The depth is truth, and I spent 3 years digging in darkness to find the truth that would bury him. My name is Mariana. I'm 41 years old, and this is the story of how my brother sold our 200-year-old family farm to developers, and how I planted his crimes in the soil, grew almonds from poisoned ground, and taught him that roots go deeper than greed. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're new here, this is where we tell the truth about families that call theft progress and call roots prison. If you've ever had someone sell your history while you weren't looking, if you've ever been told that land is just property while you knew it was memory, subscribe. We have stories for you every week, and we read every comment. Here's my story. I was born under almond trees. Literally, my mother went into labor in the orchard, my father carried her to the truck, and I arrived at the hospital smelling of blossom and dust. The farm was my first memory, my grandfather's hands, rough as bark, showing me how to crack an almond shell. My grandmother's voice, singing to the trees in Spanish that I barely understood but felt in my bones. The house, adobe, thick-walled, cool in summer, warm in winter, built by my great-great-grandfather with mud from the river he diverted with his own shoulders. The Vargas farm was not rich. It survived the Depression by selling almonds at prices that barely covered picking. It survived the 70s drought by digging deeper wells, by my grandfather working 20-hour days, by my grandmother taking in sewing until her fingers bled. It survived the 80s farm crisis by refusing debt, by selling piecemeal, by my father working construction in winter to keep the land in summer. It survived everything except my brother. Raúl was born 5 years before me. The son, the heir, the one who was supposed to love this place as I did. But Raúl hated the dirt, hated the sweat, hated the way almond prices rose and fell like breath, the way rain either came too much or not at all, the way the land demanded everything and promised nothing guaranteed. It's a prison, he'd say, watching my father work. Sweat for nothing. We could be rich if we sold. Sold to who? My father would ask, not looking up from the irrigation line he was repairing. To people who know what land is worth. Developers, golf courses, people with vision. My father said nothing, he just kept working. That was his way, silence as argument, labor as philosophy, the belief that if you tended something long enough it would teach you what it needed. Raúl left at 18. Los Angeles, he said. College, he said. But it was neither. He worked sales, then real estate, then something he called development consulting, which meant finding farmland, convincing owners to sell, connecting them with corporations that turned orchards into subdivisions. He wore suits now. Rolex watches. A smile that calculated before it expressed. He came back at 40, not to stay to harvest. My father was 68, working the orchard alone since my brother's departure, since my mother's death, since I'd left for agricultural school and then Oaxaca, and then a life that kept me away longer than I'd planned. My father died in the orchard. Heart attack, mid-morning, under an almond tree my great-grandmother had planted. I was in Oaxaca when it happened, learning regenerative agriculture from Zapotec farmers who understood soil the way my family had forgotten. Raúl called me, not to invite me to the funeral, but to inform me of decisions that needed to be made. I've been managing things, he said, his voice smooth through the phone line. Mom's not well. The farm's not profitable. We need to think about the future. I came home. Too late, as I always seem to be, the funeral had passed. My mother, Carmen, 72, with early dementia that came on like fog, didn't recognize me. She called me Raúl's friend and asked if I wanted coffee. Raúl had already filed power of attorney, already met with lawyers, already prepared the sale documents. He showed me the papers over dinner at a restaurant in town, not at the farm, never at the farm, while wearing a suit that cost more than my annual salary in Oaxaca. The Almond Ridge Corporation, he said, sliding the papers across linen. 4.2 million. Sustainable development, eco-friendly community. Mom signed the power of attorney last month. She understands it's for the best. I looked at the signature. My mother's, shaky, familiar, written on a document she probably didn't comprehend. I looked at the price. 4.2 million for 200 years of roots, for trees that survived depressions and droughts, for a river diversion that my great-great-grandfather built with his hands. Where's my share? I asked. 50,000, Raúl said, not looking at me. The land is worth more developed than in trees. I took a smaller percentage to expedite. Consider it a gift. A gift. The word didn't make sense. Gifts were given, not extracted. Gifts were received with gratitude, not discovered in documents signed by a confused woman who called her daughter by the wrong name. I went to the farm. The locks had changed. Security guards at the gate, hired by the corporation, instructed to keep out trespassers. I stood at the fence, looking at almond trees I'd climbed as a child, at the adobe house where I'd learned to cook, at the river that had sustained 4 generations. Everything was tagged with orange surveyor's ribbon. Everything was marked for removal. I didn't cry. I was past crying. I was in the space beyond grief where something harder forms, something like the caliche soil of the valley, dense, compacted, capable of breaking shovels but also capable of preserving what lies within for centuries. I went back to Oaxaca, not to stay, to learn, to prepare, to understand that the fight ahead wasn't legal. The documents were signed, the sale recorded, the machinery of commerce already moving. The fight was geological. It was about what lay beneath the surface that Raúl had never bothered to investigate. I spent 3 years as a laborer, not metaphorically, literally. I worked the orchards of neighboring farms, picking almonds, pruning trees, living in a trailer that cost $300 a month. I saved every cent. I also excavated, not during the day, at night, with a shovel and a headlamp, digging where memory guided me. My grandfather had shown me things before he died. The family cemetery, where pets and livestock were buried with ceremony. The old septic systems, installed before regulations, never properly sealed. The dumping areas from the 40s and 50s, when waste management meant digging a hole far from the house. The pesticide storage from the 60s and 70s, when chemicals were miracle solutions and poison was progress. I found what I expected, and more. The septic systems from the original homestead, pre-regulation, unlined, leaching into groundwater for decades. The DDT drums from the 60s, rusted, contents seeped into soil. The solvent containers from my grandfather's workshop, trichloroethylene, benzene, chemicals he didn't know were carcinogenic, buried behind the barn because that was how you disposed of things then. I took samples. Hundreds of them. Water from the wells, soil from the burial sites, sediment from the river. I sent them to labs, not local, not traceable, but university facilities where I had contacts from my agricultural studies. The results were devastating. Arsenic from old pesticides, nitrates from decades of fertilizer, solvents from industrial waste, all below immediate lethal levels but cumulative, carcinogenic, capable of causing birth defects and neurological damage over years of exposure. Raúl didn't know. The developers didn't know. The buyers, tech executives, retirees, people seeking eco-friendly communities certainly didn't know. They were building a golf course, houses with wells, a school. They were selling a dream built on poisoned ground. I could have reported to the EPA. Could have filed whistleblower complaints, environmental lawsuits, the machinery of regulatory enforcement, but that would have taken years. The houses would have been built, the families moved in, the damage done before any ruling. And Raúl, with his lawyers and his corporate structures, would have escaped personal responsibility. I needed something faster, something more visible, something that would connect Raúl to the poison, the sale to the secret, the dream to the nightmare. I needed to become what he had always underestimated, a woman with dirt under her nails and knowledge in her head, a laborer with a PhD understanding of soil chemistry, a sister with patience deeper than his greed. I became Dr. Maria Ortega, environmental consultant. A fiction, but with real credentials, my agricultural engineering degree, my Oaxaca training, my lab results, all connected to an identity I built carefully, traceably, professionally. I contacted the homeowners who had already purchased, not aggressively, helpfully. Free water quality assessments I offered, part of a regional health study, no obligation. They were wealthy, educated, accustomed to receiving services. They accepted. I tested their water, their soil, their air. I found what I expected, traces of arsenic, nitrates, volatile organic compounds, not immediately dangerous but present, documented, real. I didn't publish results. Didn't file complaints. I organized a community water tasting. Elegant, unusual, newsworthy. I rented the clubhouse that the developers had built, invited homeowners, local press, state regulators I knew socially from my consulting work. I served water from the development's wells in crystal glasses, with cheese and charcuterie like a wine tasting. Then I projected the results. "This is your drinking water," I said, smiling, the smile of a hostess, not an avenger. Arsenic, 12 parts per billion. EPA maximum, 10. Nitrates, 15 milligrams per liter. EPA maximum, 10. Trichloroethylene, 8 micrograms per liter. EPA maximum, 5. I paused, let the numbers sink in. Watched faces shift from confusion to concern to fear. These are the wells your developer installed. The soil your children play in. The water that irrigates the golf course where your dogs run. This land was farmed for 200 years. Before regulations, before environmental protection, before anyone understood that out of sight doesn't mean gone. I showed them historical photos. The farm, my family, the burial sites, the old drums, the dumping areas that were now beneath landscaped gardens and playground equipment. Your developer, I continued, purchased this land from my brother, Raúl Vargas. He grew up here. He knew this history. He chose not to disclose it. He chose to sell you a dream built on poisoned ground. The room exploded. Not with anger, with the precise, cold fury of wealthy people who discover they've been deceived. These were not farmers who accepted hardship as fate. These were executives, lawyers, people who sued for principle, who demanded accountability, who had the resources to pursue both. They sued, not just the corporation, Raúl personally. Fraudulent concealment, material omission of known environmental hazards, intentional misrepresentation. The corporation's stock, publicly traded, collapsed when the news broke. The golf course, half-built, was condemned by state environmental authorities. The houses, already sold, became unsellable, stigmatized property, worth fractions of their purchase price. Raúl's development became synonymous with toxic real estate. His consulting business, dependent on reputation, evaporated. His corporate partners distanced themselves, filed counterclaims, left him holding legal liabilities that exceeded his assets. But I wasn't finished. I used my share of the settlement, $800,000 from the class action, more than Raúl had ever offered me to buy land. Not the house, demolished for a model home that would never sell. Not the golf course, poisoned beyond remediation. But 50 acres of the original orchard. The trees my great-great-grandmother planted, which Raúl had considered without value in the development plan. I restored them. Not with chemicals, with the techniques I'd learned in Oaxaca. Compost tea, biochar, mycorrhizal fungi. Music played through solar-powered speakers, the frequency studies suggested encouraged root growth. Patient, slow, regenerative agriculture that treated soil as living tissue rather than growing medium. It took 5 years for the almonds to produce, 8 years for the farm to become profitable, for universities to study our methods, for the Vargas regenerative model to be cited in journals I once read as a student. During those years, I lived in a yurt on the property. No house, the original was gone, and I didn't want to replace it. I wanted to be close to the land, to the trees, to the river that still flowed despite everything. I wanted to wake with dirt under my nails and sleep with the smell of blossom in my hair. Raúl came once. I didn't invite him, he simply appeared at the fence, thinner than I remembered, his suit cheap now, his Rolex sold for legal fees. He stood looking at the almond trees blooming white against the sunset, and I saw something in his face that I hadn't expected. Not regret, recognition. The understanding that what he'd sold for nothing was producing something he couldn't buy. "You could help me," he said, not asking. Stating, as if help was his right, as if our shared blood still obligated me despite everything. I walked to the fence. Close enough to smell the alcohol on his breath, the desperation that had replaced his cologne. "The land remembers everything, Raúl," I said. "The bones we buried with love. The poisons we buried in ignorance. The secrets we thought would stay hidden, you sold the surface. I stayed for what was beneath. This is family," he said, his voice cracking. "We grew up here, we share this. We share nothing," I replied. "You took my inheritance, sold my history, and called it progress. I dug up your crimes and grew food from them. That's not family, that's geology, the slow accumulation of consequence." I turned away, walked back to my trees. He stood at the fence for an hour, maybe more. I didn't watch. When I looked again, he was gone. I never saw him after that. I heard, through distant cousins, that he left the state, worked menial jobs, died his death slowly in places without almond trees. I didn't mourn him, but I didn't celebrate either. I just kept working. I teach children now. From the new neighborhoods that replaced the failed development, working families, immigrants, people who couldn't afford the original prices, and moved in when the properties were auctioned at bankruptcy. They come to the farm on Saturdays, learn to plant seeds in the same soil where I found poison, watch almonds grow from ground that was supposed to be dead. A girl asked me last month, maybe 10 years old, her hands deep in compost. Why was the water bad? I sat back on my heels. Looked at the almond trees, blooming white, survivors of everything: drought, development, my brother's greed, my own excavation. Because someone thought land is only what you see, I said. They believed the surface was the story. But land is time. It's everything that happened before you, everything buried and forgotten, everything that waits for someone patient enough to dig it up and make it grow again. Like secrets? She asked. Like secrets, I agreed, and like love. And like the bones of animals we buried with ceremony, believing they would become part of the orchard. Everything goes down, everything comes up. The question is whether you stay long enough to see the cycle. She nodded, not fully understanding, and returned to her seeds. I watched her. This child of immigrants probably. This girl who would grow up knowing almonds could come from poisoned ground if someone cared enough to restore the relationship between soil and root. I am Mariana. I am 41 years old. I have 50 acres of almond trees, a yurt, and a habit of digging before I plant that my neighbors find obsessive. I have a brother who became a lesson rather than family, a farm that became a model rather than memory, and the understanding that roots go deeper than greed, that soil outlasts development, that the woman with a shovel and patience can outlast the man with a suit and a spreadsheet. I am still digging, still planting, still waiting for what rises. See you in the next story.